This is the LatinNews podcast. I am your host, Richard McCall, here in Bogota, Colombia. Happy New Year from all of us. This is the first episode for 2025, and we're taking on a great subject this week. It is no less than mining, and we'll be looking at Central America, and we have our very special guest. He's a journalist. He's America's editor for the Mining Journal, senior editor for Kitco, and he organizes the Colombia Gold Symposium. It is Paul Harris on the LatinNews podcast this week. Paul, welcome.
Hello, Richard. Thank you for having me on.
Oh, no, it's a great pleasure to have you on. We haven't dealt with mining in the past on the LatinNews podcast, so it's an important one to discuss because of everything that's going on in El Salvador, Costa Rica, and of course linking it to Panama and a little bit to Mexico too, because of all the arguments and political developments in this part of the world. Perhaps we could talk about El Salvador under President Bukele at the moment and some of his decisions, because, I mean, it was very recent that he pushed through that bill. Well, he didn't really have to push it through with the vast majority he has to once again permit, is it open pit metallic mining?
Well, El Salvador has deposits of gold. The gold price has had a big run up in value in recent years. It topped out about $2,800 per ounce at the end of October. It's currently around $2,650 per ounce. So his thinking is, we've got the gold in the ground. The gold price is very high. If we dig it up, we can sell it, we can make some money, and presumably he's got a plan of what to do with that money. There's a lot of poverty. There's a lot of need in El Salvador. He sees the gold deposits of the country as a resource that he can use, presumably to help improve the common weal in his country.
Yeah, I mean, we look at it as 27% of El Salvadorans live in poverty, a huge number in a country of 6.6 million. But if we put it into context, of course, it was the left-wing government previously that in 2007, prohibited and outlawed this. And I guess Bukele has said, it's absurd, is his exact words, that they don't do so. But he has made some claims about how much gold there is. Perhaps you could give us some clarity on that.
Well, yes, I think maybe he was a fisherman before he was a president, because, the one that got away is, this big, and the reality maybe it's more like that. It's difficult to say. There needs to be more exploration. But one reference point or one touch point that we can look at is the international arbitration case that was brought against El Salvador a few years back, I think 2017, 2018, before ICSID. That was Pacific Rim Mining and Oceana Gold. And they were claiming, I guess, expropriation of their El Dorado deposit. Mm-hmm. And they were seeking $250 million in indemnization, mm-hmm. which is quite a little bit less than the billions that the president is claiming is underground in his country.
And can we say that maybe there is that amount? I mean, as a mining expert, someone who's read about Central America and so on, can we say that El Salvador does have these kinds of amounts, or is it just a bit of a pie in the sky?
It's a little bit of both. So, for example, the value of the gold in the El Dorado deposit will be substantially higher than that $250 million today, because the gold price has gone up substantially. So that could be, well over $500 million worth. There could be other gold deposits there. There needs to be more exploration to determine that. Mm-hmm. So at some point, yes, it is a bit of pie in the sky, but it's not perhaps beyond the realms of possibility.
Yeah, I mean, look at these statements. He said that 4% of the country's gold deposits, I mean, these are potential gold deposits, would bring in $131 billion, a figure representing 380% of the GDP. I mean, these are pretty incredible figures.
Yes, I've no idea where he got those from, but there's quite a bit of extrapolation there. And yeah, I don't think there's really much basis for that at this moment in time.
It's an interesting one as well. I mean, you can see the importance. You can see the importance of the necessity in a country like El Salvador. But sort of mineral, I mean, we have to look at it. Mineral production, and this kind of ties into Costa Rica a bit. mineral production has never dominated the region's economies. And if we look over at Costa Rica under President Chaves, this is a country that has staked its whole economy, image, and everything else on being, a global leader in environmental and sort of ecotourism, global environmental image of Costa Rica. I mean, this could be damaging for them in terms of Chaves, President Chaves trying to push through an open pit mine there in close to the Nicaraguan border.
Well, yes and no, Richard. Yes, it could be damaging, but having such an intense sole focus is also potentially damaging. During the sort of 2 years of COVID, shall we say, the tourism sector basically evaporated, and that left Costa Rica in a very difficult position. So diversification of the economy is always a sensible thing to do. Fortunately, Costa Rica and El Salvador have means of diversifying their economies. Whether the people there choose to accept those or go with those or not is another question.
And these mines, let's say El Salvador and in Costa Rica, I know that El Salvador, Bukele has been interesting because he said that the legislation will grant the Salvadoran government sole authority over mining activities within their country's land and maritime territory, but he'll have to bring in investors. And who are we looking at, do we think?
Yeah, well, that's politicking, Richard, because the government, the state, owns the subsurface resources anyway. And so in that respect, he's just echoing or repeating something that already exists.
Yeah.
And this is pretty much the case in every country in the world. The state owns the subsurface resources, and they give concessions to other companies or third parties to exploit them. So potentially, he would be looking at presumably Canadian listed companies, maybe Australian listed companies, or even companies from further afield, such as China, that professional miners that have the knowledge and experience and the wherewithal, the investment to be able to come in and put a project together to exploit these resources.
Therein comes the question, of course. Bukele, the strong man, obviously. We know that the incoming President Trump, he likes a strong man. There might be some sort of relationship there to not prohibit, but let's say dissuade a Chinese investment in El Salvador. How do you see that panning out?
I think, we need to look a little bit closer. There's a lot of opposition from environmentalists, from human rights groups, from the Catholic Church in both countries. And it's legitimate to have concerns over mining, particularly if it's open pit mining. But mining can be done in a very safe, controlled manner. The mining sector has progressed a great deal in the past 10 years in these aspects. Environmental, social governance aspects are now sort of top of mind for many mining investors, many governments, and obviously the mining companies as well. And so in terms of environmental protections, water protections, and the ability to actually improve the environment, in addition to doing more for the local communities in which a mine is based, these are aspects that have really progressed over the past 10 or 15 years. Comparatively, a lot of the anti-miners are still very much stuck in an old mining mindset, a very reactionary and myopic mindset that's rolling out the same old arguments that haven't adapted and adjusted to the new reality of the mining sector. Okay, so that very much depends on where the mining company comes from. It's understood that mining companies, perhaps from Australia or Canada, attend to things such as environmental aspects and community aspects in a much more responsible way than miners from somewhere else, such as Russia or China, for example. Given that the presidents of both countries are looking at restarting their mining sectors, their gold mining sectors, each country has a gold deposit, Crucitas in Costa Rica, El Dorado in El Salvador. Presumably the government would be in a position to undertake a tender or bidding process to solicit interest from interested parties. Through that, they can really establish the benchmarks of what kind of company they're looking for in terms of their financial wherewithal, their financial performance, how they've treated communities elsewhere that they operate, their environmental performance elsewhere they operate, etc. essentially they can dictate the kind of company they want to come in, and also the kind of company they would say thank you but no. They're in quite a unique position from that respect. So they can really establish that we want you to come in, you've got to use best available technologies to mitigate the various things that need to be mitigated, plus what else are you going to do for us? And that could be, what else are you going to do to help develop the regions or the communities, or what else are you going to do to help protect water sources, or even increase the availability of water sources. Water is a key issue in both countries. In El Salvador, the water system is the main water source is the Lempi River, which is highly contaminated. It's contaminated from legacy mining issues elsewhere in the country, but also from human use, human waste, agricultural runoff. Now, miners in other parts of the world, in Peru, for example, invest a lot of money to help communities and regions clean up their water sources, in addition to what they do on their own projects. So the governments are in the position to say, look, if you come in, what are you going to do for us?
So it's an opportunity to show and to, let's say, publicize, someone like Bukele, the modernization of the mining industry, rather than the older and justified criticisms and fears, the Catholic Church and environmental leaders and so on. I mean, a fear for me would be, of course, human rights from various sides. And of course, Central America countries there never score well on the Global sort of Witness yearly report on sort of threats or deaths, assassinations of human rights leaders or environmental leaders. And yes, the River Lempi is so polluted, and of course it feeds San Salvador for its water too. So you're saying, and rightly so, as you know, that the mining companies could come in and be beneficial to the environment.
Absolutely. There's a good reference point here, and that is the Freeport-McMoRan and its Cerro Verde copper mine in Arequipa in Peru. As part of their social programs, they invested a lot of money to put in water treatment plants for the, I believe it's called the Arequipa River, which was, again, highly contaminated, highly polluted. The local authorities and government hadn't been able to put the investment in to keep that clean. The company took that on as part of its social responsibility programs and made a dramatic improvement there.
Okay, so we can address those things, and of course, El Salvador has a massive debt, and so we're looking at that. But again, it's not as if Bukele really needs to seek the approval of Congress. I think we know that that's a foregone conclusion there, but it would be to his advantage to actually explain some of the economic benefits for the citizens of El Salvador, have a plan rather than great sound bites from, would we say, we don't know where his report came from. We don't know where he got his figures.
Exactly. The government could, strong arm measures through, laws are just pieces of paper at the end of the day. But you have to convince the population. The government has to do that. If a company comes in, they have to do that. A buzz phrase in the mining sector for many, many years has been social license to operate. Now, your social license isn't a piece of paper. It's not a permit that you apply for and you get. It's part of an ongoing engagement process with your local communities to inform and educate them about what you do in a transparent manner, an open manner, and getting them on board. Now, depending where you are, that can involve consent processes, or it may not. But companies stress their efforts to obtain this social license to operate. Again, keeping communities informed and up to date in a transparent way, and also undertaking projects that help benefit the communities as well. At the end of the day, so there's no surprises. Everybody knows what is going to happen, and hopefully, presumably, all go along that journey together.
Obviously we see Costa Rica, El Salvador, all in the same boat, but they're very different, of course, in their political spectrum. And I'm just sort of curious about your thoughts on President Chaves. He submitted this bill to the National Assembly in November of last year to reverse the ban. How do you see this progressing?
Well, before I answer that, let me just tack one thing onto my previous comment.
Absolutely.
When you don't have social license to operate, things break down. We saw that very clearly in 2023 in Panama.
Yes.
The government negotiated a contract with First Quantum Minerals. Both parties there did that in good faith, but the government didn't really include any mechanisms with local communities, with the local population, to socialize the agreement and what it meant. That ended up in protests, and ultimately the mine was shut down at great economic loss to the country, and with the loss of, I don't know, was it 40,000 direct and indirect jobs to the population. Now, sorry, Richard, what was your question again?
No, it's all right. I was talking about, but we can continue on that in Panama and then come back. It's that was the copper mine up there,
Yes.
and it was the massive social process. I was actually in Panama during this, not there for the protest myself. I was trying to get to the ports, and the country was brought to an absolute standstill. And of course, it was very violent, with something we haven't attributed to Panama since, I suppose, Noriega years. It really was. And I remember speaking to Panamanian friends, those who work in the tourism and industry and so on. It's like, well, the real question is, do we want to be a mining country? But can we, it's one mine. It doesn't make you a mining country. But yes, there was a loss. But again, the arguments against it, was it the Chaves? I can't remember, the two rivers that feed into the canal. And of course, the canal at this point was at the lowest it's ever been in terms of water. And so there's a huge fear surrounding that. I mean, there's a knock-on effects because it was believed, and I mean, I'm no expert on this at all, you are, it was believed that the water to be used to the copper mine could additionally affect the Panama Canal.
Well, that specific aspect, Richard, was complete, smoke and mirrors or BS or whatever, however you want to phrase that, because the mine's in a completely different watershed. It's not just in the next watershed. I think there's, 2 or 3 or even more watersheds between the mine and the Panama Canal. So, there's no impact one on the other at all.
Okay, well, thank you. But it's an interesting one because, of course, Costa Ricans will be looking at Panama and so on. So my previous comment was really about President Chaves in Costa Rica submitting the bill to the unicameral National Assembly to reverse the ban. How do we feel that might pan out?
I would be less optimistic on that than the change that's happening in El Salvador, because President Chaves doesn't have the same level of support or majority of support, or however you want to describe that his part in El Salvador does. So that could very much open into a more sort of popular debate, because the politicians participating in that, they'll have pretensions to be re-elected, and so the voices of their constituents will probably ring louder in their ears. As we've talked about, there's tourism in Costa Rica is one of the main economic activities. It's something people are very keen to protect and extend. But this is perhaps something that doesn't get talked about a lot. Tourism has its own environmental footprint, which can be considerable. So for Costa Rica, all those cruise ships spewing out fumes, all those airplanes coming in spewing out emissions, the emissions, the erosion of environment because of the growing number of tourists. In other parts of the world, tourism is causing other problems in terms of cost of living. We're seeing this in big tourist centers in Europe. The increasing number of Airbnbs and things like that make it increasingly difficult for local populations to afford housing. There's also water usage. So, tourism isn't necessarily a panacea in and of itself, and perhaps needs to be viewed within a broader context of what do we want our economy to be.
This is true. And of course, yes, the debate over tourism, and I can understand I can understand the pushback on that. In a country like Costa Rica, the gentrification that takes place, and of course the increase in prices displacing the traditional communities from areas. But one would hope that they've got a better setup, because they've been so involved in this for so long.
There are other considerations as well. The tourism sector does employ a lot of people, but are they quality jobs? A lot of those, I would argue, are not quality jobs. They're not particularly high paying, and they're, service jobs. There's also a big argument to be made, okay, you've got your environment, you want environmental tourism, great. How do you protect that environment? I would imagine a lot of the people involved in the tourist industry don't necessarily contribute anything financially or otherwise to the protection of those environments. And this is one thing that big resource projects can do. For example, in Panama, First Quantum was, because they're able to, let's say, put a fence around a piece of land, they're able to keep outsiders out and protect, big parts of the jungle. Since the mining operations have stopped, the mine site or parts of the mine site have been inundated with illegal gold miners. Illegal gold mining is an issue in Costa Rica as well, in some of the national parks. So you have the question, okay, you can put a fence around thing and declare a national park, but where are the resources going to come from to protect that? And this is, one of the questions that governments or communities don't often ask themselves. This would apply to El Salvador as well.
And I think one of the interesting comments that I've read, in preparation to this is, of course, when we think about Mexico, obviously North America, Mexico, but a knock-on effect of, let's say, debate in Costa Rica, and indeed then most likely, I think we can suggest the pursuit of open pit mining being successful in El Salvador. A knock-on effect to Mexico is it puts pressure on that country to reconsider its restrictive policies as well towards mining. But you do have an environmentalist as president there. Perhaps, how do you feel regarding Mexico?
I'm perhaps a glass half full person. I believe, everything is possible. So, I think it is possible to have a mining sector that does respect communities, that does make, real positive contributions, that does, protect the environment. One increasing thing that you're seeing in mining projects around the world is the concept of compensation. I'm going to dig a hole here, which means I'm going to impact the environment here. I'm going to chop down some trees. Sorry about that. But as a compensation in another part of the country or the region, I can help improve the environment. I can plant new forests. I can protect forests or what have you, help with biodiversity, create environmental corridors. I can provide the funding and the technical knowledge and the plants and what have you to do that. So allow me to impact this, this 10 hectares here, this 15 hectares here, and I can help improve the, a much bigger piece of environment elsewhere.
And I'm curious again. So I think in El Salvador, though, the issue is that there will be no mercury used to seek out gold. Is this right?
Absolutely. Modern gold miners do not use mercury. It's only illegal gold miners, informal gold miners that use mercury. Modern gold mining typically uses cyanidation to extract the gold. And cyanide is, yes, it's potentially damaging and harmful compound, but it's one that naturally neutralizes through exposure to oxygen. And modern gold mines have cyanide destruction circuit, which basically involves putting in lots of oxygen to help accelerate the breakdown of the harmful elements of cyanide compounds so that it doesn't create harmful things. One of the best projects I've seen related to this in my sort of 20, 25 year career as a mining journalist was in the high Andes of Peru, where a gold mine, its cyanide destruction circuit went into a series of pools. And in the last pool, they had a fish farm as a way both of creating protein for the local population, but also of visually showing them that the cyanide production, the process results in a neutral, clean sort of water.
Did you eat the fish?
I didn't know.
That was a clear one. I'll move on a little bit here. There's very interesting what is going on in Central America, of course. It is very interesting. And we would suggest that El Salvador will move ahead because of, again, the authority there. I wouldn't be so sure on Costa Rica. And it looks like President Mulino in Panama will be revisiting the the issue of the copper mine as well, whether he does it above board or so on, or just tries to slide it through some way. We'll see. Of course, one of the big elements here, and it's Central, South America and other parts of the world, is hopefully some of the money does trickle down. I mean, we've seen too many opportunities for money to go astray in these projects. But I think because we're both based in Colombia here, let's talk just very quickly about this. You're in Medellin, I'm in Bogota. We have Colombia's first ever leftist president in power, and it's been a continual debate about the new mining code. Is this ever going to be actually presented to the public? Have you seen a draft?
I've seen drafts, Richard. I think that the sort of general view is it's perhaps unlikely that President Petro doesn't have widespread support in Congress. Increasingly doesn't have widespread popular support. The vast majority of his legislative initiatives have drawn blanks or run into walls. And, I think reforms to the mining code is going to be another one of those. The mining code Colombia's mining code law 685 of 2001 isn't perfect, but it's generally seen to be a very good, workable document. Yes, it needs some changes, some enhancements, but to go the whole hog and draft a new mining code is seen by many as overkill.
Yeah, what I understand from it, it's all about community participation and opinion on these things. And then to try and involve the artisanal miners and legitimize it. And so I see a knock-on effect again, going back, this kind of policy going back into Central America, as we say, the whole community involvement and therefore they get to have an opinion on these things. I mean, this is a positive thing.
Yes, and I think most mining companies in this day and age actively seek to, outreach to communities to get their opinion, to have them to a greater or lesser extent participate in planning processes. This is becoming more and more common, whether it's legislated or not, because at the end of the day, it's just good business practice. Mm-hmm. Companies want the community approval or them to be aligned, and so as part of that, they outreach and talk about what they're doing and try to get them on board. Again, whether that's regulated or not. So this is part of an ongoing wave. I think there are issues though, because there is some sort of conflation between let's say professional, modern, large-scale mining and small-scale mining. It's not always compatible because the deposits don't always lend themselves to sort of doing both things. And also in Latin America, in Colombia particularly, unfortunately, small-scale mining, artisanal mining is increasingly involved in or intertwined with illegal criminal groups, which brings its own set of problems. Mm.
There aren't the illegal criminal groups permeating potential mines in Central America?
Well, I think that remains to be seen. The miners that have invaded Costa Panama's concessions, they're perhaps on their own without any specific support or backing from criminal groups. In El Salvador, there is quite an established sort of criminal level to the economy, if you like, and criminal gangs there. So if that takes off there, I imagine they're going to be very quick to get involved in that.
Well, yeah, I mean, they've imprisoned 1% of the population, I'm sure. And then as we wind this down, Paul, Honduras, we look at, I think the incumbent, I think we've got elections coming up, Xiomara Castro this year. I would expect that she's put in a pretty rigorous system to crush any opposition. So they don't look like reversing any of their policies on mining, do they?
Well, there is a bit of mining in Honduras, some base metals mining, but I agree with you. Similar in Guatemala, Guatemala has developed mines, but the anti-mining segment in Guatemala has been very, very successful, serially successful in getting mines shut down.
Huh. Very interesting indeed. And again, a year to watch then, what's going on in Costa Rica and definitely in El Salvador and its knock-on effects within the region. Thank you for the commentary on Colombia too, because I do think all of these things are relevant, definitely, because there's an eye on every country in the region when it comes to this. And as you would expect, the geopolitical situation and, of course, the threats of tariffs, the threats of trade issues from North America, the expansion of China into the region. It's definitely something to watch.
Definitely. And, unfortunately, in this part of the world, Richard, and, this extends to Africa as well, with high metals prices, high gold prices, high copper prices, you're in a situation where, mining may happen whether you like it or not, whether it's legal or illegal. So the question for governments and communities is, who do you want to do that mining? Do you want it to be a formal company that's going to create benefits and wealth for the region and the country? Or do you want it to be illegal armed groups that are going to use it for their own nefarious needs and means?
Or companies from yes, autocratic governments with no respect for human rights or the modernization of it. Well, thank you very much to you, Paul Harris, for sharing your thoughts here on the LatinNews podcast. I've learned a lot, definitely, and I will be keeping an eye on these things. Of course, keep an eye out for Paul's writing. He's the Americas editor for the Mining Journal and the senior editor for Kitco. He also organizes the Colombia Gold Symposium, will be taking place in the beginning of November 2025. So keep an eye out on that as well. Very good for networking, as I've read all over the internet. Very good for networking for mining companies and people in the industry. So again, thank you so much for your time. This has been the LatinNews podcast, and we've been talking to Paul Harris. I've been your host, Richard McCall, here in Bogota. Bye-bye.